The church of St. Aurelius stood at the edge of the village, its steeple rising like a finger pointing toward a heaven that had long since fallen silent. It was an old place, older than anyone could remember, with stone walls weathered by time and ivy creeping over the stained glass like veins under pale skin. On Sundays, the villagers gathered in its pews, bowing their heads in whispered reverence. But none whispered louder than the silence that hung in the air when the choir stood to sing. For years, the choir of St. Aurelius had been known for their hauntingly beautiful hymns, songs so ethereal they seemed to linger in the bones of those who heard them. That was until one winter's eve, when the music ceased. No one knew exactly why it happened. One Sunday, the choir sang as they always had, voices rising in unison. But the next, as the organ's first notes filled the air, not a single voice followed. Their mouths moved, their faces showed devotion, but not a sound left their lips. At first, the congregation thought it was some kind of mistake. The organist faltered, glancing back at the choir with confusion. The conductor, an elderly man named Aurelius Grayson, waved his hands more urgently, urging the singers to continue. But still, nothing. Only the eerie hush of breath without voice. Panic rippled through the church. Some believed the choir had made a pact of silence, a protest against something unseen. Others whispered that it was an act of God, a divine punishment for sins unknown. But as the weeks passed, it became clear, the singers wanted to sing. They tried, mouths forming words they could not hear, throats straining against the weight of an unnatural silence. Then, one by one, they stopped attending service. By spring, not a single choir member remained in St. Aurelius. Some left the village altogether, others took to their homes, shutting their doors and drawing their curtains. Those who remained were changed, haunted, hollow. When asked what had happened, they merely shook their heads, eyes clouded with something deeper than sorrow. Only Aurelius Grayson remained steadfast. "I will not leave this place," he told the new vicar, a young man named Father Benedict. "The choir may have lost their voices, but I will not lose my faith." But faith alone could not explain the strange occurrences that followed. The first was the sound. Though the choir had fallen silent, villagers swore they heard singing in the dead of night, soft, distant, yet unmistakable. The melody was one they did not recognize, one that did not belong to any hymn they knew. And though the voices were quiet, there was something wrong about them. A distortion in the harmony. A hollow echo, as if the singers were calling from beneath the earth. Then came the figures. Shadowy shapes glimpsed within the church after sundown. Some claimed they saw the outline of people standing in the choir loft, unmoving, watching. Others swore that, just before dawn, they saw Aurelius himself standing at the altar, his lips moving in silent prayer, his shadow cast long and unnatural behind him. And then, one morning, the vicar entered the church to find Aurelius Grayson seated in the front pew, hands folded neatly in his lap. His eyes stared forward, unseeing. His lips were parted as if in mid-song. He was stone-cold dead. In his pocket, the vicar found a note written in trembling script. "They sing for me now." The funeral was held 3 days later, though few dared to attend. Aurelius Grayson had been a devoted servant of St. Aurelius, a man of unwavering faith. But now, the villagers spoke of him in hushed tones, as though fearing that even the mention of his name might summon something unseen. Father Benedict conducted the service with a heavy heart. Rain fell in sheets, turning the graveyard into a mire of black earth and slick stone. As the coffin was lowered, the silence was suffocating. Not a single bird called from the trees. Not a breath of wind stirred the branches. Even the rain seemed muted, its sound swallowed by the ever-growing quiet that had settled over the village. Afterward, the mourners hurried home, clutching their coats against the cold. But Father Benedict lingered, watching as the grave diggers finished their work. He felt uneasy, though he could not say why. Perhaps it was because of the church. Since Aurelius's passing, something had changed within its walls. The air was thicker, heavier. The flickering candlelight seemed weaker, as though struggling to push back an encroaching darkness. And there was the matter of the whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, but always there. That night, Father Benedict sat in his study, poring over the old church records by candlelight. He had hoped to find some clue, some hint as to why the choir had fallen silent. Instead, he found something else. A passage in an old journal, written by one of his predecessors nearly a century before. The choir sings beautifully, but at night, I hear them still. They stand in the loft long after the service has ended. I have told them to go home, yet I find their shadows lingering. And the song, oh, the song they sing. The rest was smudged, ink blurred as though by a shaking hand. Father Benedict closed the book, pulse quickening. He had not told the villagers what he had heard the night before, what he had seen. It had been just after midnight when he awoke to the sound of music. The hymn was unfamiliar, sung in a language he did not recognize. It was soft, almost a lullaby, yet something about it set his nerves on edge. He had risen from his bed, wrapping a shawl around his shoulders before stepping into the corridor. The sound was coming from the church. He hesitated, every instinct screaming for him to turn back. But he was a man of faith. If there was something within Saint Aurelius, it was his duty to confront it. By the time he reached the nave, the singing had stopped. The church was dark, save for the glow of the candle he carried. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting with the flicker of the flame. Then, a sound. A breath, long and drawn, as if someone was standing just behind him. He turned sharply, raising the candle. Nothing. Just empty pews and the great, yawning silence of the church. Then, from the choir loft above, the floor creaked. He was not alone. Slowly, he stepped forward, the wooden boards groaning beneath his feet. The stairs to the loft loomed ahead, disappearing into darkness. With a steadying breath, he began to climb. Each step felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted him. The closer he got, the colder it became, his breath curling in white wisps. When he reached the top, the choir loft was empty. But the chairs were not. They were facing the wrong way. Instead of facing the congregation, they had been turned inward, forming a perfect circle. In the center, the hymn books lay open, pages fluttering despite the still air. And then, just for a moment, he heard it again. A single voice, soft and breathless. A whisper, right against his ear. Sing with us. The candle flickered. The shadows moved. And Father Benedict ran. Father Benedict did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with the candle burned low, hands trembling as he clutched his rosary. The words whispered in his ear still echoed in his mind. Sing with us. By morning, the fear had settled into something colder, resolve. He had come to St. Aurelius to guide this parish, to be a shepherd to his flock. If there was something wrong in the church, he could not turn away. So, as the first light of dawn filtered through the stained glass windows, he made his way to the choir loft once more. It was exactly as he had left it, chairs still arranged in a perfect circle, hymn books still lying open. But something had changed. Footprints. Faint, but unmistakable. A trail of dust disturbed by bare feet, weaving between the chairs. He crouched down, running his fingers over the impressions. They led not to the stairs, but to the great stone wall at the back of the loft. A dead end. Or was it? Father Benedict stood, pressing his palm against the cold surface. It felt solid beneath his touch, but something about it felt wrong. He knocked once, then again. The second time, the sound was hollow. There was something beyond this wall. But before he could investigate further, the church doors groaned open. He turned sharply, expecting to see one of the villagers. Instead, he found himself staring at a figure he had not seen in months. Catherine Holloway. She had once been the choir's brightest voice, a soprano whose voice could bring grown men to tears. She had vanished along with the others, locking herself away in her home, refusing visitors. But now, she stood in the doorway of St. Aurelius, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. "Catherine," he called, his voice echoing in the silence. She did not move. Then, slowly, she lifted a single finger to her lips. A warning. And then she turned and walked away, vanishing into the morning mist. By midday, word had spread. Catherine Holloway had returned, but she was not alone. The other missing choir members followed soon after. They emerged one by one, stepping from their shuttered homes, moving as if in a trance. They did not speak. They did not acknowledge the villagers who stared at them in horror. They simply walked, silently, purposefully, toward the church. Father Benedict stood at the steps, watching as they approached. There was something unnatural in their movements, a weightless grace that sent a chill down his spine. They entered the church without hesitation, their bare feet silent against the stone floor. And then, without a word, they ascended the stairs to the choir loft. Father Benedict followed. The air grew heavier with each step. He could hear his own breath, his own heartbeat. And then, nothing. The choir stood in their places, facing inward once more. The hymn books had closed, and when they turned to look at him, their mouths moved in perfect unison. No sound came out, but he could hear them. Not with his ears. With something deeper. Something inside him. And for the first time since he had arrived in St. Aurelius, Father Benedict felt true, unshakable terror. Father Benedict gripped the railing of the choir loft, his knuckles pale with tension. The choir stood before him, their mouths moving in perfect unison, though no sound escaped their lips. And yet, he heard them, somehow. It was not a sound in the air, but something deeper, vibrating in his very bones. A song that did not pass through ears but through something more primal, more ancient. It was a hymn unlike any he had ever known, its melody crawling into the spaces of his mind where words did not belong. The choir's eyes did not blink. Their lips did not falter. Their bodies stood unnaturally still, save for the slow, eerie movement of their mouths shaping verses that should not exist. Father Benedict's breath came shallow. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to step forward. What are you singing?" he asked, though his voice felt thin and distant. None of them answered. None of them even acknowledged his presence. He moved to Catherine Holloway, the choir's once prized soprano. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath her skin, as if she had not eaten in days. His voice lowered, gentler this time. "Catherine, what happened to you?" Her lips continued to move. No sound. No break in the rhythm. But her eyes, there was something there, something trapped behind them. A flicker of recognition. A plea. And then, for the first time, the choir moved. Their heads turned, all at once, their hollow eyes locking onto him. Father Benedict staggered back, his stomach twisting. It was not the movement itself that sent a shudder through his spine, it was the delay. The heads had turned, but their mouths had not stopped moving. As if something else controlled the song. Something unseen. Something watching. He took another step back, his boots scuffing against the wooden boards. The floor creaked, breaking the suffocating silence. The choir flinched. The mouths stopped. And for the first time in months, the choir of St. Aurelius stood in total, utter stillness. Then, one by one, their lips began to bleed. Thin rivulets of red traced down their chins, dripping onto their pale hands. Some of them trembled, their bodies convulsing as if fighting against an invisible force. Catherine moved first. Her mouth stretched open, wider and wider, the skin at the corners of her lips splitting apart. Her throat spasmed as if trying, desperate, to produce sound. Father Benedict lunged forward. "Catherine! Stop, you don't have to." Then she screamed. A soundless, gaping scream. And in that instant, every candle in the church went out. Darkness swallowed the loft. The air turned heavy, pressing against his chest. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with something living, something breathing. Then he heard it. Not the choir. Not Catherine. But something deeper. Something beneath the church. A voice, low and ragged, rasping through the void. "You hear us now." The floorboards beneath his feet groaned. The walls shuddered. And then, in the pitch darkness, hands, cold, unseen, closed around his wrists. Father Benedict thrashed, gasping as the unseen hands tightened around his wrists. They were cold, not the cold of winter air, but something deeper, something ancient and lifeless. His candle had gone out, leaving only a suffocating darkness pressing in from all sides. The choir remained silent. Their heads had turned toward him, their lips split and bleeding, but they did not move. They did not react. They stood like statues, bound in their silent torment. Then the hands pulled. A force stronger than any living thing yanked him downward. His knees struck the wooden floor, splinters biting into his skin. A sharp, guttural whisper rasped through the darkness. "Come below." The floorboards beneath him groaned again. No, not groaning, giving way. He scrambled backward just as the wood beneath his knees collapsed, revealing a gaping black void beneath the choir loft. A damp, rotting smell rose from below, thick with the scent of earth long undisturbed. The air was wrong, too still, too heavy, as if something long buried had just taken its first breath. Father Benedict gritted his teeth, yanking himself free from the unseen grip. The choir did not react. They remained frozen, unmoving, their mouths trembling in silence. But Catherine's lips formed a single, desperate word. Run. A new sound filled the church. A low, distant humming. Not from the choir. Not from the empty nave below. From beneath. It was a song without words, deep and droning, vibrating through the stone foundation like a heartbeat. Father Benedict forced himself to his feet, backing away from the gaping hole. He had spent his life devoted to faith, to scripture, to the comfort of holy words. But in that moment, standing before the black void beneath St. Aurelius, he had never felt farther from God. The humming grew louder. Then something moved in the dark. Not the choir. Not the shadows. Something else. A hand, thin, gnarled, its fingers too long, emerged from the hole, pressing against the wooden floor. Then another. The air turned freezing, thick with something foul and hungry. Father Benedict turned and ran. He barely registered his own footsteps as he fled down the narrow staircase, past the empty pews, past the cold stone walls. He threw himself at the great wooden doors of St. Aurelius, expecting resistance. But they opened easily, as if something had wanted him to leave. He stumbled into the graveyard, breath ragged. The village lay beyond, untouched, as if nothing had happened. As if the horror behind him had not moved. But it had. A shadow stretched from the church doorway. Tall. Unmoving. Watching. Father Benedict did not stop running until he reached the village square. Only then did he turn back, his pulse pounding in his throat. The church doors had closed. The shadow was gone. And from within St. Aurelius, a single voice rose in song. Not the choir. Not Catherine. Something older. Something awake. Father Benedict stood in the village square, his breath heaving, his hands trembling. The sound from within St. Aurelius was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was a song, but not a hymn. Not something made for worship. It was wrong. The notes were stretched too long, the melody warped like an echo from deep water. It rose and fell without pattern, slipping in and out of harmony like something trying to remember what music was. Then, as suddenly as it began, the song stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. A single, shuddering breath escaped him. And then he heard the church doors creak open. Slowly, deliberately. He did not turn around. He could not. Instead, he stared at the villagers who had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the noise. They gathered in small clusters, murmuring in hushed, fearful voices. "Did you hear it?" one man whispered. "Aye," another muttered, clutching his coat tighter around his thin frame. Sounded like the old choir, but not quite. A woman gasped. "It's them. They've come back." Father Benedict swallowed hard, forcing himself to turn. The church doors stood wide open, revealing nothing but the yawning dark beyond. And then, one by one, the choir began to step outside. Catherine was first. Her dress hung from her frail frame like old cloth draped over a forgotten statue. Her eyes were sunken, her lips still raw from whatever force had stolen her voice. But she was smiling. Not a warm smile, not a joyful one. A hollow, empty smile, stretched too far across her face. The other choir members followed, moving in perfect silence. The village fell still. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if the very world was holding its breath. Then Catherine took a step forward. And another. The others followed. They walked in slow, measured movements, weaving through the village like mourners in a funeral procession. But there was no grief in their expressions. No sorrow. Only that smile. And they were headed somewhere. Father Benedict's stomach turned. They were walking toward the well. The old village well had stood for centuries, its stones smoothed by time and weather. It had been dry for years, nothing but an empty hole leading deep into the earth. And yet, The choir walked toward it with purpose. The villagers stirred uneasily. "Where are they going?" someone whispered. "They're not speaking," another muttered. "They haven't said a word." Father Benedict took a step forward, then another, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. "Catherine," he called. "Stop." She did not. None of them did. They reached the well and, without hesitation, began to climb onto its edge. One by one, they perched on the crumbling stones. Balanced. Waiting. Then Catherine turned her head toward him. Her lips moved. No sound. But he understood. "We go below." And then, before he could stop them, before the villagers could cry out, they fell. All of them. Plunging into the well like birds dropping from the sky. Their bodies vanished into the blackness. A second of silence. Then, the song began again. But this time, it came from beneath the ground. And it was not just the choir that was singing. Something else was singing with them. The choir had vanished into the well. The villagers stood frozen, their eyes wide with horror, their hands clasped over their mouths. The silence that followed was suffocating, unnatural, pressing against their chests like unseen hands. Then the singing began again. Not from the church. Not from the village. But from beneath the earth. Father Benedict felt the sound vibrate through the stones beneath his feet, rattling through his bones. It was the same haunting melody, the same wordless hymn, but this time it was many voices, more than just the choir. Something else was down there. Something waiting. The villagers scattered, some running for their homes, others falling to their knees in frantic prayer. But Father Benedict did not move. Instead, he stepped closer to the well. The song was louder now, rising from the depths like a tide. He peered over the edge, into the gaping blackness below. And then, a hand reached up. Not human. Its fingers were too long, its skin stretched thin over jagged bone. The nails were black, splintered. And where the wrist should have ended, another hand began, twisting impossibly into itself, forming a grotesque spiral of limbs. Father Benedict staggered back, choking on a breath. But the hand did not climb. It offered. Something dangled from its fingers, swaying gently in the night air. A silver cross. His own. The one he had worn around his neck since childhood. His fingers flew to his throat. It was gone. He had not lost it. He had not given it away. It had been taken. His stomach turned. The thing in the well had touched him. It had known him. The song swelled, filling the night, echoing through the village with a terrible, aching beauty. It was no longer eerie. No longer wrong. It was familiar. And suddenly, he understood. The choir had not been stolen. They had been invited. A choice, not a curse. And now the invitation was his. Father Benedict stared into the darkness. The hand still waited, still offering his stolen cross like a gift, a promise. The song pulled at him, winding through his veins, whispering in his ribs. It was beautiful. It was calling. He took a step forward. And then another. The last thing the villagers saw before they fled, the last thing anyone ever saw of Father Benedict, was the moment he climbed onto the edge of the well. He did not scream. He did not hesitate. He simply stepped forward and let the darkness take him. Days passed. Then weeks. The village emptied, house by house. The few who remained refused to speak of what had happened. They refused to speak at all. No one returned to St. Aurelius. No one prayed at its altar. No one dared step foot near the well. And yet, every night, the song continued. Not from the church. Not from the village. But from below. Growing louder. As if waiting for the next voice to join. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. If you're craving more mysteries, thrillers, and spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss out on the next chapter. The darkness is always waiting, and the next story could be just around the corner. See you in the next one, if you dare.